Okay. All right. So, Mr. John, looks like you're new to us, perhaps. I think you're on the text thread, but I
Yep.
don't know that we've seen you in these meetings for some time. So I'll give you a really quick overview of what we talked about last week. So, in the text thread, these last couple weeks, we've been talking about plant-based proteins. Um, last few months, we covered plant-based carbohydrates from sugars, starches, and fibers, and now we are in the protein category. So last week, we talked about just how much protein you can get from plants and went through a few exercises to see how possible it is to get all the protein that you need uh, from plants in one day. So meatless meals for a day, you can actually get all the protein you need. Meatless meals for a week, meatless meals for a month, you can still get the protein that you need based on calculations that we use to roughly estimate about how much protein each of us might need. So we talked about the quantity of protein that these different plant foods have. And now this week, we're actually going to talk about quality of protein. And so as we have this discussion, I'm actually going to pull up this diagram that we had up last week that you said was really helpful. We all thought this was really helpful. So we talked about quantities of protein, but I want this diagram in the background while we talk about quality of protein that comes from plants. Again, as possible, go ahead and interact. I'm going to throw a question out to the group. Have any of you ever heard that plant protein is lower quality than animal protein? Is that something anyone has said to you before or that you've read?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
No, I have not heard that.
Okay, good. We've got one yes, we've got one no. And
Now, I haven't
uh-huh.
heard whether it's better or worse, but I've heard that I guess mostly that there isn't protein in vegetables. And that's kind of like, as a young man, you're always eat more meat to put on, to get your protein, to stack on your muscle mass and all that good stuff. And in that, there are no vegetables.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you brought that up. So that's why we have this handy chart in the background here. So these data are from the USDA, a database that the USDA provides on which nutrients and how much of each nutrient is in the foods that Americans commonly eat. So you can see here, going from even 18 grams downward, there are some really simple plant-based meals, snacks even. That's how small some of these serving sizes are, that you can eat and get just as much protein using these plants, beans, for example, get practically just as much protein as you would get from a serving size of fish. So I know you all remember this, Miss Bridget, Miss Maddie, you remember this from last week, but we talked about how salmon, about 3 ounces or so, which is about the size of a deck of cards that sits in your palm, about 3 ounces of salmon is a serving size of salmon, according to the USDA. And that gives you about 20 grams of protein. So a serving size of lentils is about 1 cup cooked. Um, Also, a very large scooped out handful, maybe 2 palmfuls worth. 1 cup of cooked lentils gives you 18 grams of protein, nearly as much as what you get in salmon, which is actual animal muscle, right? Actual animal meat. Not quite as much as you'd get from a chicken thigh, which will get you about 28 grams of protein. But we learned that, lentils aren't the only foods that deliver a really powerful protein punch. You've got pinto beans and black beans and black eyed peas and green peas, which all deliver right around 14 to 18 grams for 1 cup cooked for each of those serving sizes. And then, we talked about how you can get, say, 6 grams of protein from 2 tablespoons of almond butter or from a handful of almonds. We talked about how you can get about 5 or 6 grams of protein from 1 cup of wild rice, and then closer to 8 grams of protein from a cup of quinoa. So it turns out you've got, quite a bit of protein that can come from these beans and these grains and these nuts and seeds. But then, believe it or not, we moved down to this 3 to 4 grams category, and we learned that there are actually a bunch of green veggies that give you a decent amount of protein. So, I would not have guessed before learning this that asparagus, 1 cup of cooked asparagus or 1 cup of cooked Brussels sprouts gives you about 4 grams of protein per serving. That's pretty incredible. And then, as you all remember, last week, we went through an exercise to identify, well, how much protein does a body really need? And the quick estimate was that for most of us who are moderately active, who are not, bodybuilding, we're not Olympic athletes, we're going to the gym on a regular basis or walking around our neighborhoods or doing some sort of exercise on a regular basis, we need about as much protein per day, as many grams of protein per day as equals 1/3 of our body weight in pounds, which is much less than most Americans get. So the takeaway was that we don't actually need as much protein as we're getting. And when you consider that a lot of us only need somewhere between 40 to 60 grams of protein a day, then you start looking at this chart through different eyes. And you see, okay, 18 grams of protein in 1 serving is about 1/3 of 60 grams. If that's your floor, if that's your minimum level of protein that you need for the day. So eating 1 cup of lentils and getting about 1/3, possibly even nearly half of your daily protein requirement makes it clear it's possible to get enough protein. Is any of that information that you guys don't remember from last time? Does anything pop out to you as kind of new or more relevant? Not
I think
quiet.
it's helpful. I think it's helpful to know that those beans, the lentils, pinto beans, green peas, black beans, and black-eyed peas give you that really good boost of protein. So just that, sprinkled on some salads or a couple of meals, you really can get enough of your. You really can't get enough of your protein requirements for the day.
Okay. So what about you, Mr. John? Because you brought this up, right? This is something that I hear from boys, young men, older men alike. There is always this concern that if I'm a guy who's in the gym, if I'm lifting weights, then I've got to eat some meat. There's no way I can get enough protein without eating meat, possibly red meat even. Did what I just explained, did any of that make sense to you or not make sense maybe?
I think so. it was interesting seeing like even on the other corner, like the different milks. So you can actually get, you know, from almond milk. I think that that's a good source. And then obviously the beans and stuff like that. That definitely, it's helpful to see it visualized like this. I
Okay.
remember like like Arnold Schwarzenegger or all the, you know, bodybuilder types would just, you know, eat like 10 egg omelets, or they'll
Mm-hmm.
drink these like raw egg things. And so it's like, well, you know, that's getting you in the 5 gram category. And you can also reach that with quinoa as well. So that's just something that's interesting to visualize.
That's a really good point. Maybe you don't need to drink like 6 or 10 raw eggs. Maybe you don't need to put your body through that. Maybe you can just
Yeah,
eat
you could spare yourself the
grains and
cholesterol.
exactly, get some extra fiber from your grains, um, get some extra healthy unsaturated fats using almond butter or a handful of almonds, for example. Okay, so this is great. We're on the same page here.
I have a
Now,
I have a question. I
yeah,
don't know whether this is gonna, there are two things that either I can't find or that are not here, and maybe you can just help with that. So
yeah.
I've heard like Greek yogurt is really good, and then I've also heard that obviously nuts, like, so you have nut milk and almond butter, but what about you know, peanuts or almonds or walnuts? And then what about like
Yeah,
Greek yogurt? Are those, any idea where those would fall on this spectrum?
yeah, absolutely. Good question. So, throughout this chart, we've got some um, animal-based products to sort of orient you, right? On the lower end, we've got some dairy milk to show you that nut milk offers just about as many grams of protein as a similar serving of dairy milk. We've got in the middle eggs to show you how almond butter is comparable in terms of grams of protein. And then you've got the actual meat on the higher end of the spectrum. So yogurt, Greek yogurt actually falls somewhere closer to um, around 15 to 17 grams per single cup.
Oh wow.
So it packs quite a punch. Now, the conversation we had last week is, we have varying levels of plant-based eating or plant-based eaters on this call. So there are some folks here who will say, I'm not eating any yogurt, I'm not eating any dairy products. And we talked about how exactly to substitute that really powerful protein punch that you get from dairy products. But for folks who do eat dairy products, again, really helpful to incorporate yogurt as a snack, as breakfast, in a yogurt parfait, in some sort of smoothie, for example. Again, 1 cup gives you 17 grams. I think typically a half cup is considered a serving size of yogurt, even Greek yogurt. So I would cut that down to maybe around 8 to 9 grams per serving if we're going to cut that 15 to 17 in half. I guess we'll call it 7 to 8 grams per serving. If you're talking about only a half cup of yogurt. And then we cut that in half further if we're talking about plain non-Greek yogurt, which has less concentrated protein. So 1/2 cup of plain yogurt, for those who aren't a fan of Greek yogurt, um, that'll get you about 4 grams per half cup, or about 8 grams per whole cup. So still really significant. And, an argument can be made that depending on what the rest of your diet looks like, if you're not strictly vegan, there's room for using, strategically using dairy yogurt as part of a balanced diet, getting the protein benefit along with the um, the probiotic benefit, so the gut health benefit, uh, And if you can go low fat with the yogurt, so low or no fat, and make sure that you have no added sugars, then you're really minimizing the harm that's associated with dairy products. So you asked about yogurt. That answers that question. Any more questions about yogurt before I move on to nuts?
Nope.
Okay, so then you asked about almonds, and those are actually in this same 5 to 8 gram category. They're comparable to this 1 serving size of almond butter. So we get about 6 grams of protein from 1 ounce of almonds. 1 ounce of almonds is about a palmful. It's actually quite a few. It's about 24 almonds. So, we want to remember that eating a palm full of almonds, eating 24 almonds gives us quite a bit of healthful fat. So yes, the fat is heart healthy, it's that unsaturated fat, but that also comes with calories. So you want to take into account what your full diet looks like. What are you eating throughout the day? Are you getting significant levels of unsaturated fat from other places in your diet throughout the day? Have you worked with a provider who's outlining specific calorie requirements for you? How would this handful of almonds fit into that requirement? So that's the only caveat I would give. Other nuts, generally walnuts, peanuts, tend to have a lower grams of protein per serving size for similar 1 ounce serving size. So we may be looking at closer to anywhere from 3 to 4 grams for many of those others. But still a great addition to a smoothie, to a snack, to a salad, to up your protein intake. Okay, all good questions. Anything else? Did I miss anything there?
Nope.
Okay, all right, thank you. So what we wanted to talk about today, actually, and I'm glad that we spent more time on this quantity question because it sounds like this is something that we could talk about for much longer, actually. We may be coming back to this in the future. But, we talked about quantity of protein last week. And the second thing you want to think about when you focus on dietary protein, getting enough protein in your diet, is you think about quality. So that's why I asked that question at the beginning of the meeting. Have any of you heard that plant protein is lower in quality? And that's because I actually spent a lot of time hearing from, friends, peers, that plant protein is lower quality because it's has what we call incomplete proteins. So protein is made of these building blocks like Legos, and they're called amino acids. So if protein is the main structure, there are these Legos with different colors, so different types of amino acids, and they all fit together to form protein, but depending how many yellow you have versus how many red, so the content of these amino acids and their proportion is what tells us, well, what type of protein structure are you actually making? And our bodies need certain levels of each amino acid. And there are these 9 amino acids that are considered essential because we can't make them. There are many other amino acids that our bodies can make from taking one amino acid and adjusting the chains and turning it into another one. This incredible magic that is our body. But there are these 9 that we can't make, so we have to get them from our food. And when people talk about complete proteins, that's what they're talking about. Are we eating a protein that has all 9 of these essential amino acids? And so all animal protein does have all 9 of the essential amino acids, but not every plant protein has all 9 of them. So I'm going to pause there. Is everybody still with me? Still making sense?
Yes.
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 Okay, all right. Sometimes the amino acid thing loses people, but you guys are sharp. So we've got these plants that don't always have, most of them, frankly, don't have all 9 of the amino acids in the quantities that our body needs. And so way back in the day, like in the 60s and even 70s, when veganism was, becoming, if not mainstream at the time, a little bit more popular, there was this notion that you could use this really complicated method of combining plant proteins, right? So some plants are going to be higher in one type of amino acid, and other plants are going to really lack that type of amino acid. And if you could eat that plant and this other plant together in the meal, then you basically have the equivalent of a complete protein, right? They would complement each other. And so that ended up being really discouraging for folks because the thought was, well, so I have to think really carefully about every single thing that I eat. And, I can't just eat beans alone. I have to eat beans always with rice, or I have to eat beans always with some other, some cereal or some grain that is going to complement the beans. And it turns out that what we've learned over the last couple decades is that eating complementary proteins doesn't have to be complicated. Somewhere during the course of the day, you want to generally get all 9 of the amino acids that you need, right? And you want to get enough of them, but you don't have to have a complete set in every single meal. So the kind of the lesson of the day, just as each of our lessons, just as each of our week's lessons matches up, the lesson for today is that eating a balanced diet is one of those ways. Eating a diverse and balanced diet is one of those ways to kind of mindlessly or relatively effortlessly get the nutrients that you need. So in a second, we're going to talk about which plant foods you can combine to get complete proteins. And we'll talk about these on a high level, and then we can do some exercises to just sort of help the lesson sink in. I'm going to pause there again. Everybody still with me? What questions do you have? What did or didn't make sense about that?
It makes sense.
It makes sense.
Okay. So probably the major pairing to remember for getting complete plant-based proteins, and actually before I go there, I'm going to tell you that there are actually some complete proteins, plant-based proteins that exist, where you don't have to use complementary proteins. You don't have to combine them with some other food. So can anybody name complete plant-based proteins for me? And if not, that's okay.
Quinoa.
Yes, I was just going to say, Miss Maddie mentioned it earlier. So, yes. So we've talked about beans previously, especially lentils, as being just amazing for fiber, amazing for giving us large amounts of proteins. But it turns out that they are not complete proteins. But you know what is? Quinoa is. So quinoa is sort of our superstar plant for this protein conversation that we're having. I'm still really partial to lentils. They still have they hold a special place in my heart. But for now, quinoa, there's 1 cup of quinoa that gives us about 8 grams of protein. We can rest assured that those 8 grams are complete protein, the same quality of protein or the same type of protein that you get from animal products. There's another grain that gives you complete protein, and that is buckwheat. So buckwheat is something that we've probably seen in grocery stores. If we haven't, it's available in many supermarkets, just in the grain aisle. It can be used. It can be used as a grain. It is a little bit. It's kind of the way that it cooks up. It's kind of a mix between quinoa and maybe rice. Very fluffy like rice, but still with a nutty quinoa-like flavor. Really filling. It can also be used, some people might use it in the mornings as a sort of hot breakfast cereal, adding a bit more liquid to it to make it sort of more of a mush. And so we've got quinoa and our buckwheat as our complete proteins. And then can anybody think of another complete protein that's not a grain, but is still, it's something green, and you might not be able to think of this, but it's algae. It's actually this specific type of algae called blue-green algae. So we've talked about spirulina in the past as a source, like one of the only plant sources of this high intensity omega-3 fatty acid, the kind that you usually only get from fish. Well, it turns out this same type of algae is also a great source of protein. And it's no wonder that this would be so nutritious, because it's what fish eat on a regular basis. So it ends up being really helpful for us too. So those are our main sources of complete plant-based proteins. But we can't live on just buckwheat, quinoa, and blue-green algae alone. So let's talk a little bit about protein combos. The overarching theme for protein combos would be beans or legumes plus grain cereals. So can anybody name a few beans, grains combos?
Rice and beans.
Red beans and rice.
There you go.
Exactly. We have a lot of different combinations of red beans and rice. And really quickly, I don't know how curious you guys are, but it turns out that it's lysine that ends up being most complementary. Lysine is one of the 9 essential amino acids that is higher in beans and lower in cereals and grains. But they're complementary in that sense. So you can round out the completeness of the protein. We've got red beans and rice. We've got, say, black beans and rice. We've got, right, like that's more of a possibly even like a Mexican food flair on the black beans and rice. We've got beans and rice that you would get in a burrito or a taco bowl, for example. We've got, what else do we have? We have wheat tortilla, flour tortillas, and beans. So in the form of a burrito or a bean taco. We've got anything else you guys can think of. Beans and grains. So that includes rice, wheat, which means flour, bread. I'm gonna throw out there pita and hummus. So right, hummus is chickpeas, and that is a type of legume. And so we've got our hummus, and then we've got our pita bread made with flour. And so that's a great combination. So we're kind of going down the list, and you can imagine how across multiple cultures, humans evolved to eat combinations of grains and beans. And there's probably a reason why that happened, and why the folks eating beans and grains lived long enough to, and were healthy enough to reproduce and then pass on those eating traditions. Anybody else think of some grains and beans combos? Yeah, let's see. So we have pasta made with grains. So we traditionally think of whole wheat pasta, but most pasta is made of semolina, a different type of grain. So if, Miss Bridget, you talked about this bean pasta salad you had, beans plus pasta can round out those proteins and, end up giving you complete proteins. So we got a lot of different options.
What about peanut butter and jelly on a whole grain bread and a peanut butter or almond butter?
Yep. So peanuts as legumes, and then almond as a nut and seed can actually, their butter, their paste can combine with the cereal or the grains to create complete proteins. So there's just so many different combinations, right? Let's see. Trying to think of what else we might do here. You're not going to put beans on a pizza, on a pizza crust. But you might do hummus. We said hummus on pita, but you might have some French or Italian bread lying around, and you might use hummus with that. So that's kind of our take home: beans and grains, B and G, for complementary proteins. Any questions? I see we've got some new folks here. We've got Mr. Christopher and Mr. Christian just came in. Hi, welcome.
I have a question.
Yes.
So my trainer tells me that I can't, excuse me, that I can't have legumes. Why is that?
I don't know. I would ask your trainer. Did the trainer give you any insight as to why?
I have no idea, because I didn't think they were horrible for you. What if, like a black bean isn't bad?
Right. So yeah, it's difficult to give. So I'm not able to give, personal medical advice here or personal healthcare advice, since I don't know your risk profile or your background. But I think some people look at carb content of food.
Mm-hmm.
And so some people who advocate for really low carb diets will end up cutting out foods that are holistically healthy, because they have a certain number of carbs, a certain grams of carbs, or certain grams of sugar. So, there are some people who will tell folks with diabetes not to eat any fruit because it has sugar in it. But what studies have shown is actually that the sugar in whole fruits is generally metabolized pretty well by the body. And, if you read guidance from the American Diabetes Association, if you go to their website, they talk about how helpful the fiber in fruits and the phytonutrients in fruits like oranges is for people who are actively battling diabetes. So I'm not sure if your trainer or if other folks who are anti-bean are looking just at the macronutrients, because beans are a starchy product. But as we've discussed, in earlier weeks, there is this starch that your body digests and turns into sugar. And there is this starch that exists in much lower quantity in beans that is resistant starch. It actually doesn't get digested, and it gets fermented by bacteria in your colon, and they produce these really heart healthy and anti-inflammatory products that are great for your gut, great for your heart, etc. So, I think it ends up being really important for people to have some of this resistant starch, and the fact that beans are a source of resistant starch, raises their health profile in my eyes. But again, I can't say without knowing more why your trainer might be anti-bean.
Gotcha. That's really helpful.
Yeah. But that's a really good question, because I'm not sure if you were here earlier in the workshop when we discussed what's on the screen here, which is actually that you get really large quantities of protein from legumes like beans.
Mm-hmm.
And particularly, on this chart, you see that we get about 18 grams of protein from 1 cup of lentils. So that makes it, and we just discussed, complementary proteins, how we've got to pair
Right.
grains with beans at some point throughout the day, right? If you're eating beans, try to eat some grains. It doesn't even have to be in the same meal, just to make sure that you get enough of each of your 9 essential amino acids. But, that aside, getting 18 grams of protein from just 1 cup of lentils, that's also going to give you amazing fiber and this resistant starch we talked about.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's really incredible.
Right.
Yeah. Any other questions? That's a really good one.
Oh, I have another
Okay.
one.
Uh-huh.
What about proteins in beans for kind of psychiatric health? Does that kind of
Oh, that's
improve?
interesting. I don't know anything about that. I would have to look that up.
Yeah, I bet it probably facilitates and better creation, and probably just like kind of and neuroprotective probably in some degree, like omega fatty acids would be.
I can imagine that, actually. We've talked about how important it is to get enough protein, right? So we tend to think of protein as a muscle building agent only, but neurotransmitters are built with amino acids. They're built from protein.
Right.
And then, a number of our hormones are also protein based. So yeah, one of the negative side effects of not getting enough protein, having protein calorie malnutrition, would be depression, anxiety, possibly related to dysfunction of or abnormal levels of neurotransmitters, among other things. So yeah, I can imagine a world in which maybe eating high quality plant proteins that also deliver these high quality omega-3 fatty acids might be really valuable. And so you'd get more. I'm trying to think if there's a food that'll give you that specifically, but the spirulina that we talked about gives you the high quality protein and also the high quality omega-3 fatty acid. And then the almonds give you plant-based protein and a different type of unsaturated fatty acid. So not so much omega-3s, but monounsaturated fatty acids. So still very valuable. And then I think walnuts might end up being a better source of those omega-3s plus plant-based protein.
Walnuts, interesting. Okay.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to look this up. This is really interesting.
That's really helpful.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good to know. Those
Yeah.
are really good questions. I'm gonna have to, if I come up with anything, I'll put it in the text thread. I think you were on the text thread, right?
Right.
Okay, wonderful. So I'll make sure to mention something about that if I come up with anything. And if you do, feel free to just text, the Byte Wellness number.
Will do.
Pass anything on. Thank you. All right, guys, I think that we are wrapping up unless we have any more questions. Again, when we're thinking about getting enough protein from our diet, the two things that you want to consider are quantity, and we talk about how exactly to calculate a general estimate of how much protein you'll need each day. And then we talk about quality, and that includes eating these whole food proteins, which is something we keep hammering home. As much as possible, instead of eating protein powder, denatured protein, or even animal-based protein, if we can prioritize whole food plant proteins, then we almost certainly get at least one other really valuable nutrient. So in plants, you're not going to get just protein. You're going to get protein, usually plus fiber, protein plus whatever phytonutrients that plant has, that plant magic stuff we keep talking about, that science hasn't done a really good job of figuring out the utility of, but that studies keep showing is incredibly powerful and beneficial to the human body. And the fiber that comes along with protein is going to help us manage our weight so we can maintain a healthy weight. It's going to lower our blood sugar so that we can avoid developing diabetes or better manage it if we have diabetes, type 2 diabetes or prediabetes. And the protein also tends to come with these healthy fats when it's found in whole food plants. These healthy fats we just talked about with the walnuts and the almonds, these unsaturated heart healthy fats. So, if in terms of quality, if you can prioritize whole food plants, the less processed, the better, then you're likely to get protein plus something good. And then if you can just keep in mind this idea of complementary proteins and this B and G framework where you're eating, say, beans or legumes and grains, not necessarily together in the same meal or snack, but at some point throughout the day, eating some portion of beans and then also some portion of grains in order to secure those complementary proteins. That's the way to eat a balanced diet and make a habit of it so it's less painful and more automated. Okay, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. Really helpful to have all of your input as usual. Next week, for those of you who are in the healing circle, you will get a text message for our healing membership conversation that's going to happen at the same time next week, Wednesday at 6 p.m. Central, 7 p.m. Eastern. For those of you who aren't in the healing circle, you can actually go to bytewellness.com/healer and you'll get a message next week reminding you what link you can go to so that you can join in with the next chat. If you're not able to advance our healing membership right now, don't worry, you will still get the daily text messages. You will still be able to reach out to me directly. And once a month, on the first Wednesday of every month, we will have this conversation and be able to come back together again in this virtual space. Okay, Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good week.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.